Thank you everybody for coming this afternoon, and thank you Professor Lee for that very kind introduction. Today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about my own research methodology, particularly as it applies to the types of texts that I'm interested in. I study late Imperial Chinese literature, and most specifically I study texts on recent events. My hope is that people here will find these types of tools very interesting and possibly even consider adopting them for your own research. I'll get both into how these methodologies work and the sorts of things they can and can't tell us about late Imperial Chinese literature. Now, during the late Ming and the early Qing dynasties, which I very broadly am defining as around 1550 to 1700, which is actually earlier than most people go, there was an unprecedented interest in telling about the recent past. Yeshi, or these unofficial histories, as well as novels on current event and drama on current events, really flourished. And collectively, I'm calling these types of texts quasi-history. Now, this term is not something that's been particularly heavily theorized. Rather, it's just a shorthand term for these types of texts that all show very similar sorts of content. They tend to tell the same sorts of stories in very different generic formats. But what I'm most interested here in is yeshi, or these unofficial histories, because these are a very amorphous type of genre that are somewhat problematic for a lot of readers and a lot of commenters in the late Imperial period. And I tend to follow Lao Tie's definition in the text, the Yeshi Zidian, in which he defines these yeshi as privately authored historical books in opposition to those produced under governmental authority, such as zhengshi, or official histories. And they often recorded the news and customs of the lanes and villages and hearsay on old affairs. Now, the goal here in this talk is to specifically answer the question, what are yeshi from a stylistic standpoint? And how do we use quantitative digital methodologies to answer this question? And particularly, how do they relate to novels on historical events on the one hand and official histories on the other? Because in this period, there's a lot of back and forth between all of these different categories. Now, what yeshi did, and what quasi-histories in general did, was pass on a lot of rumors and innuendo, but they were viewed, yeshi in particular, as being very important for filling out information that was being left out of official historical documents. Particularly if you read people like Wang writing in the late 16th century, in his work, the Shisheng Kaowu, or research into errors in history, he lamented that there was a lot of things being left out of official historical documents for political reasons. And you could actually use these yeshi and family histories and other documents to fill out this information. But he also viewed them as quite problematic because they were so prone to including rumors and innuendo. So what we see here is that there are a lot of lines between these different genres, between history and fiction, being blurred because they're all being produced on topics of very similar nature. And this is happening both in terms of how the authors of these works are envisioning the enterprise they're engaged with. Because when you read the prefaces to many yeshi and many novels on current events, the way they describe their works is almost identical. Another way in which these texts tend to be confused with each other is when you look at bibliographic documents that are produced in late Imperial period. When scholars were composing the official bibliographies, for example, for the Suku Chuanshu or the complete library of the four treasuries, what they would often do is they would take these yeshi, these unofficial histories, and they would place them into the Xiaoshuo Jialei. And the Xiaoshuo Jialei is essentially a category that includes long narratives that tend to be now viewed as relatively fictional. And there are a lot of people that take issue with this, particularly because there are multiple historical categories in these old bibliographers, but they're being reserved, I think, for other types of histories, which I'll discuss here in a moment. And doing this, placing all of these yeshi into the Xiaoshuo, is something that's criticized by a lot of both modern historians and late Imperial commenters. For example, Xie Guozhen writes a lot about these yeshi being placed into the Xiaoshuo Jialei. And Shao Yiping and Zhou at Fudan University in 2008 wrote an article called Discussing the Non-Generic Quality of the Classic Bibliographic Studies Conception of the Novel, feeling that by placing all of these yeshi into the Xiaoshuo category, it's essentially comprising a trash can for hard to classify long-form narrative works. Now, by the late Ming, one of the big problems with this is Xiaoshuo has become its own very distinctive genre with its own style. And So from a literary perspective, we have to start wondering, why are they making this classification? If the bibliographers are understanding xiaoshuo as a category for long-form fictional narrative writing, what is it about the Yeshe that's causing them to be placed into the xiaoshuo category? Now, I think bibliographers' motivations can actually be partially explained by tradition. If you look at some of the work that Xie Guozhen has done on the subject, he actually points to a very early description of xiaoshuo that's found in Bangu's Hanshu. And in it, they say, or Bangu says, that the authors of xiaoshuo pass along what emerges from the petty functionaries, and they're being concocted by those who transmit the chatter that's being heard upon the street. Now, this is really interesting to me because this particular definition is very similar to how people in the late Imperial period conceived of Yeshe. Now, it is a little absurd, I think, to claim that that particular definition of what xiaoshuo is has continued on unchanged for the 1500 years that's intervening the late Imperial period and the Hanshu. But what we find is a lot of historians in China are making this connection and thinking this is one of the rubrics that they're using to classify these Yeshe as xiaoshuo. Now, Lao Gun, who is a scholar in China, has come up with a collection of these Yeshe, and in them he describes these Yeshe as works that are not written under official auspices, so they are non-systematic, unspecialized, and unrefined, and they were more or less composed as rumors were heard, written freely with no additional scrutiny. Now, this is very similar to that earlier definition of xiaoshuo, or the earlier description of xiaoshuo we see in the Hanshu. But I think when bibliographers are choosing to place all of these Yeshe in the xiaoshuo category, they're making essentially a normative judgment that Yeshe should not be read as sanctioned history in any sort of manner, because these authors are operating outside of what's essentially a government monopoly on the construction of historical documents. For example, all of the different bureaucracies that go into making these documents, they're leaking information, and a lot of this is making its way into Yeshe. So in some ways, all of these historical documents on recent events form a type of erosion of the governmental control of this knowledge. Excuse me. The other problem is that the relationship between these Yeshe and these novels is further complicated by novelists' tendency to adopt the term Yeshe for their own novels. For example, the Xiutai Yeshe, which is translated perhaps as the unofficial history of the embroidered school, is in fact just a pornographic novel with no real historical content. So you have to wonder what exactly is what is happening rhetorically that makes them choose this term for their novels. But I think there are some other historical developments that tend to account for this close relationship between these Yeshe and these xiaoshuo. Sheldon Liu discusses much about the early development of fictional narratives out of the official histories, the biographical sections. And he sees that Tang Dynasty Chuanqi are emerging from this tradition, and this eventually develops into what we know as xiaoshuo in the late Imperial period. Now, this complicated relationship between these various modes of unofficial historical narratives in the late Ming and in the early Qing dynasties is really quite important because it's a time when writing about recent events is very, very popular. Xie Guozhen is claiming, or has claimed, there were over 1,000 authors writing these Yeshe at the time. This is likely a bit of an overstatement, but it's very difficult to actually get a sense for how many of these works were being written at the time because many of them are no longer extant. Many of them were also written in manuscript forms, so they were not necessarily widely transmitted. In Lao Tie's dictionary, he actually describes 487 of them that were written during the Ming Dynasty, and 167 from the late Ming and the early Qing. So there are quite a few of these texts that are still extant and fairly well documented. The question is how many of these are about relatively recent events, because that's what I'm most interested in. And if you do a meta-analysis of his dictionary, what you actually find is the vast majority are in fact about the Ming Dynasty, and those that are written in the late Ming and the early Qing, which he does not define, but it's roughly 1620 to 1670, the vast majority of those are also about the current dynasty. And this is actually normalized for the length of period about which these texts were written. Now, the other question is, what is novels' relationships? Are they interested in talking about recent events? We can do the exact same sort of analysis about novels written from 1550 to 1700 using information taken from various late imperial bibliographic sources and modern sources like the Zhongguo Tongsu Xiaoshu Zhongwu Tiyao. What we find is that novels that name an explicit time period are almost always about the Ming or the Qing dynasty when they're written in this particular time period. Now when we focus in a little more closely onto the reigns in which they were written and written about, novels that were written about the Ming dynasty, about 60% of them are about the current reign or 3 reigns in the past. And I know that people like Professor David Wang here have written extensively about the increasing use of novels in this time period to try to mediate people's understandings of recent events. And what we find is that there's actually a very surprising focus on the recent past from texts from this period. And this particular decay, which is a log decay, is very similar to what they find in Google's Culturomics project, where they're looking at mentions of certain years in millions of, it's from an article called Quantitating Culture Using Millions of Digitized Books. What they find is a very similar log decay in mentions of years. So to me, this shows that there was a kind of an unprecedented interest in telling about the recent past among these texts. Now, the question, this is why I'm interested in the first place, but the question becomes, how do we start to understand the complicated relationship between these novels and official histories on other hands? And I think there are a number of different levels that we can approach this from. First, we could obviously very closely read many of these works. And this is a very important part in beginning this type of research, and one of the things that I work with in my own research is looking at how people described the eunuch Wei Zhongxian, who in the 1620s nearly managed to take over the imperial government from the Tianqi emperor, who was fairly weak-willed. But after the Tianqi emperor died, the Chongzhen emperor had Wei Zhongxian executed quite quickly. And in the aftermath of his death, there were a very large number of texts written about him that tried to explain where he came from and why he was able to take over, or almost take over, the government, and then that explained his death. And these were written in many different genres, but there were a lot of yeshi and a lot of xiaoshuo written about it. And these yeshi are very interesting because when you read them at the same time as these novels, they're very, very hard to tell apart. Although, for example, the Yujin Xingtan or the new discussions of the Jade Mirror actually is usually classified as a yeshi, but sometimes as a xiaoshuo, depending on what bibliography you're looking at. Another way of trying to get a hold on this type of research is to step back and do what Franco Moretti likes to call distance reading. There are 2 large ways that I try to do this in my own research. The first is to look at print cultural production. We can do things like using large bibliometric data sets to explore shifts in textual size, and then we can look at quasi-historical texts and see how they relate. Just very quickly, some of the sorts of things you can see here are shifts in the distribution of textual size across the late imperial period. From 1550 to 1800, what we find is the vast majority of texts are about 270 square centimeters. But once you get into the 1750s and later, you see either the emergence or the survival of more and more very small format text. As you can see, this will be increasing fairly significantly over the later imperial period, and it continues to go up across the 19th century at a rate that suggests that it's faster than just because they are now surviving at a higher rate. But we can talk about this more if people have questions about this. But finally, what we can get into is what the main focus of my talk today is the full text analysis of digitized transcripts. Because what we do when we operate on the level of the text themselves is we can start to use a lot of very interesting corpus linguistic techniques and digital manipulations that offer some new insights to what's going on. And my research is essentially an attempt to marry these 3 types of approaches, these close readings, these very, very distant print cultural analyses, and then actually looking very closely at a significant number of digitized texts. Now, this quantitative analysis allows us to see the internal structure of a lot of these texts, to see if there's any internal textual evidence that will suggest if or if not yeshi is a cohesive category that can be understood as a genre in its own right, and how closely it relates to fiction on the one hand and official histories on the other. And yeshi are a very prime candidate for this type of analysis because of their very large numbers and their very often poorly written character means is that they've been fairly neglected by scholars, with the exception, of a few relatively exceptional examples. Now, the solution that I came to when trying to analyze these texts is something called stylometry. And what stylometry is the use of certain types of corpus linguistic techniques to try to determine authorship. Now, it offers a very interesting proxy for style because it makes what I think turns out to be a very justified assumption that individual authors each have a unique signature that can be identified based on the frequency with which they use certain types of vocabulary. As I mentioned, this was originally intended mostly for authorship attribution studies, and one of the earliest examples, and one that I think defined the field, was conducted in the 1960s by David Wallace and Frederick Mosteller. And they used the frequency of certain function words within texts, such as of, the, upon, and things like that, to try and to determine the author of 12 disputed Federalist Papers. These Federalist Papers, both Alexander Hamilton and James Madison claimed to have written, but when they did this type of analysis, they concluded that, in fact, James Madison most likely was the one that wrote them. And this is relatively in agreement with what historians think is the case. And I'm going to step back very slightly for a second here and discuss what exactly this means, because David Holmes and Judith Cardos comment on this particular methodology in an article called Who Was the Author in Chance magazine. And they say that stylometry, the statistical analysis of literary style, does not seek to overturn traditional scholarship by literary experts and historians. Rather, it seeks to complement their work by providing an alternative means of investigating works of doubtful provenance. Now, this is really important because while this is a new way of approaching these texts, it's not the only way, and it's not meant to get rid of other forms of analysis such as historical or direct literary readings. It's just another angle that we can take at it to learn things that aren't obvious from normal modes of reading. Now, there's a lot of historical evidence that this approach is pretty useful. Perhaps the most famous example of people using stylometry to determine authorship comes from 1996, when an anonymous author wrote a novel about the Clinton campaign called Primary Colors. It was written anonymously, and a linguist, Donald Foster, used this exact same approach and determined that the author was Joe Klein. And this actually erupted in a pretty large amount of controversy. Joe Klein very vehemently denied that this was the case. But after a lot of back and forth, he eventually admitted he had, in fact, wrote this novel. Now, early examples of this are using simple frequency counts. How often does somebody use the word of or upon? But later scholars can depend on some more advanced statistical analysis and tools that we can adopt from linear algebra. Now, even though the earliest purpose of this was authorship attribution studies, what a lot of scholars have found is we can use this to study genre, because it is essentially a quantified way of studying style. And it's operating on what are called most frequent word lists of most frequent words, and various manipulations of these lists will let us see either authorship or genre, sometimes content, and there are a lot of different things that we can start to pull out of this. Christoph Schosch, who's a scholar in Germany, has explored how we can reveal genre rather than author by increasing the number of frequent words that we're looking at. Now, this analysis can range from 40 function words, which is what we saw in the early examples, all the way up to 3,000, 10,000 most frequent words. He found in the case of French at least, that one often needs to include at least about 750 of the most frequent words in order to get a relatively clear clustering by genre. And what clustering means I'll discuss here in a second. Authorship is a little harder, or excuse me, in Western languages, authorship is a very strong signal. In Chinese, it's actually the other way around, because in Chinese, genre has such strong stylistic conventions that if one wants to try and get at authorship in disputed cases, you have to control for genre in some way. Now, there are some drawbacks to this type of study, and some of them should be fairly evident already. The first is that it's very heavily dependent on how we curate the text that we put into our analysis. If we remove one text and put in a different one, the results will look fairly different. How we're forming the units of analysis, how do we determine what a word is very important. It's even a problem in English, but it's very much a problem in Chinese studies. And some of the other problems is this author versus genre signal. This all has to be empirically determined. So far, nobody has come up with a good theory for why certain numbers of frequent words are more evidence of author or genre. To my knowledge, there's a lot of work going on in this field, so maybe somebody has figured this out at this point. Another issue is depends on fully digitized transcripts. And this is a problem in the case of late Imperial Chinese literature. Not a lot, or rather a very small portion of these works have actually been digitized. Where do you find them? Where do you find accurate late Imperial Chinese texts? It's actually a problem that's surprisingly difficult to overcome. Because a lot of people who are uploading these texts onto the internet don't necessarily have a very careful eye. They don't really care if a few characters are wrong here and there. But in spite of some of these drawbacks, there are a lot of benefits that I think really recommend this approach for late Imperial studies. The first is that it's very quick and it's scalable. Now, if you wanted to study 100 years, if you want to read them, reading 100 is going to take significantly longer than reading one. Preparing all of these texts for analysis does take a while, but after that, there's really not much of a difference between analysis based on one text and analysis based on 100. So it's very quickly scalable, and we can start to see large-scale trends in these texts. And if we're lucky, the sheer amount of data that we're using will wash out some of these smaller inaccuracies that are introduced when people digitize these texts. And finally, the dependence on curation is not necessarily a flaw as long as we keep in mind that this does have a significant influence on our analysis, because it marks a certain amount of flexibility, and we can see a lot of different interesting things happening. Very quickly, how this type of analysis is done, the tools that I would recommend using are R, which comes from the Project for Statistical Computing. It's essentially an open source MATLAB. It's a statistical environment that's, the learning curve is a little steep, but once you get a hold of it, it's really quite good. And the Computational Stylistic group, which is a group in Germany, has put together a package that has a lot of scripts that will help you do stylometric analysis quite quickly. Most of what I've done is actually done on my own scripts, but they have a lot of very good visualization schemes that help out with this. The other question is, where do you find the texts? Sources for some of these texts. Project Gutenberg's a really good source. They allow you to batch download everything. Just don't scrape it with your own scripts. You can actually use a batch downloader and they'll just give you everything. ishare.is.cine.com.cn was a great source, but it's actually currently defunct because of the current campaign against pornography in the mainland. They were hosting a lot of slash fiction that came into conflict with that. Google and Baidu is another good source, but be very careful. There are viruses out there. Friends are an excellent source. You never know what people might have on their hard drives that'll be useful for your own research. If anybody has digitized texts, I would love to see them. I wouldn't actually recommend at this point a lot of academic sources, mostly because their terms of use preclude you from downloading their information and using it in the way that I'm about to show you. That being said, there's a lot of stuff already out there. Now, the other question now becomes, how do we decide to break apart Chinese literature? And because what we're working with are lists of most frequent words, we have to come to terms with this. Now, this process is called tokenizing, and this is breaking apart a sentence into discrete parts that our computer programs can start to perform statistics upon. Now, for very classical work, it's actually not that big of a deal just to use individual characters, and as you can see, well, the Ming is Jiao Li You Ren. It's just my name. If we break it apart into characters, all the computer sees is discrete units. It has no idea what any of these things mean, but you and I know that yo does not make any sense as exactly identical to de, because they are semantically very, very different. So what we would really prefer to see is something like this. 我的 my means the name 叫 Li You Ren. This is much more in line with what we know to be how it should be broken apart. And fortunately, there are a lot of groups out there that are working on how to break these sentences apart in a meaningful way. I know that Professor Peter Bull has worked with the team that's published on this exact subject, and Stanford has a group, and they've actually put out a parser that anybody can use to break them apart. It's not great for late Imperial vernacular works because most of their training sets are based on modern Chinese. Now, and a lot of this scholarly activity is happening because of an interest in text-to-speech and machine translation. It's a really important problem in computer science. So we can actually benefit as those technologies get better and better. When we go to do this type of analysis, the first step is to sanitize everything. This is just from the first part of the Ming Shi. We would just pull out all of the punctuation and all of the white space because they don't mean anything for late Imperial literature. convert everything from traditional to simplified characters, because many of your texts will be different. And if some of them are different, the computer will think that a traditional character, guo, for instance, is completely different than the simplified version, and we don't want that. And then dump non-Chinese characters, URLs randomly show up in a lot of these texts. Then what we do is we have to normalize for length, because if we want to compare a text like the Jinpingmei with, say, a Feng Menglong short story, it's very hard to compare something that's over 700,000 characters with something that might only be 12 or 13,000 characters. So what I do for much of my analysis today is just break them into 10,000 character chunks. And then once we do that, we can have a computer script just run through and count how many times each character shows up in the text. And then we can start to do some very interesting things. And we can actually see that these data structures will tell us some interesting things about the style of the text. And this is done with what's called a vector space model. And each of these vectors, which are points in space, basically, the closer they are in space, the more likely they are to be related in some way. And a lot of search engines operate on this same principle. To give you an idea of how this works, imagine we have a hypothetical set of 5 documents, and we want to compare them based on how often bu and le show up in the texts. Well, each row would be a vector, and this is a document term matrix, and we can just graph them on the axes bu and le, and we find that documents 2 and 3 are most similar. This is just using Euclidean distance or straight line distance, but in stylometry we use what's called cluster analysis to group the text together based on their relationships. And what this would find in this case is that these 2 are most closely related, followed by documents 1 and 4, and then document 5 would be paired here. And then it would pair everything together like this. And this is generally represented with a dendrogram. The length of all of the branches represent how distally related they are to each other. But what happens when we have 5 or 100 or n variables? The problem becomes that it's very hard to visualize this. We can still use Euclidean distance because that works in n-dimensional space, and we can still cluster them, but we can't easily visualize them in, like we just saw in the last slide, or the slide before that. So here we can start to learn how each individual character is influencing the data set by using what's called principal component analysis, which shows us the variance within our data set. And when we do that with this, it gives us principal components which are basically function in a way as abstracted representations of our data set, and often they'll correlate with authorship or genre, or if we're lucky, content or various other things. For this data set, it looks like something like this. We see 2 and 3 are still most closely related, but we can actually see how each character is influencing where each of these documents are showing up. And this becomes really important when we're trying to analyze our results. So all of this is well and good, but what does it mean when we try to apply it to late Imperial Chinese literature? Well, keep in mind that every time we're looking at these results, we have to be asking what are we seeing and what, if anything, is it telling us about the questions at hand. Now, unfortunately, a representative sampling of late Imperial Chinese quasi-historical documents doesn't really exist yet. More and more are being added to the internet, and there are more efforts to try and help this, but what we can do now actually can tell us some very interesting things about the relationship between all of these different texts. So I start my analysis with a collection of texts that I think most people in this room should be relatively familiar with. I start with the 4 major Ming novels, The Plum and the Golden Vase, The Water Margin, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and The Journey to the West. I include 4 dramas. They are The Tale of the Lute, The Register of the Pure and Loyal, The Peony Pavilion, and The Peach Blossom Fan. And then I include 4 Yish, and unfortunately these are relatively obscure, but they're all about the late Ming dynasty. And then 2 other novels. One is a vernacular novel and one is a classical novel. And when we perform this type of analysis, we get this. This uses the 100 most frequent characters and the 10,000 character vectors. And there's some very interesting things that are happening in this. This is an unrooted dendrogram, similar to what I showed you a second ago. But there are a few things I really want to call your attention to in this. Because we've used text that most of us are familiar with, we can actually evaluate what's happening on here. And I apologize if the colors are a little hard to see on this slide. But here we have The Plum and the Golden Vase, The Journey to the West, The Water Margin, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Now, interestingly, these 4 major Ming novels are not very closely related to each other. But what we can see is actually that 3 sections of The Plum and the Golden Vase are far more closely related to The Water Margin up here than they are to the rest of The Plum and the Golden Vase. And those of you who are familiar with these texts will know that this is because the beginning of the plum and the golden vase is actually taken from the water margin. Wu Song's elder brother, his wife is having an affair with somebody. Wu Song kills them in the water margin, and that's the end of the story. In the plum and the golden vase, they survive and go on to wreak havoc on the world. So that's really, and all we're doing is using these frequent word vectors. There are several other organizing principles that are happening here that indicate that this is very good for identifying genre in the Chinese context. The drama all show up on a very, very small clade, and a clade is just a collection of these branches. Because, as you might know, they're very distinct in terms of their style from the rest of the literature that we're looking here. Further, the Yeshe, these unofficial histories that I'm quite interested in, all are here by themselves together, and with one actual section from the Quasi-history, which is a classical novel. There's another organizing principle. On the right are texts that tend to be much more vernacular, and on the left are texts that tend to be classical. I know that the Romance of the Three Kingdoms is often considered a vernacular work, but in fact it's simplified classical, and this provides just another level of evidence that that is the case. Now, of course, we're not using very many texts here. Only four Yeshe does not tell us much about the genre and its relationship with vernacular novels or classical novels or official historical works. So what we have to do is start to introduce more texts. And when we introduce the Ming, the official history of the Ming, into this analysis, we see some interesting things. This is still using those 14 other texts. I've chopped off the section with the vernacular works because that doesn't actually change very much. Some things move around a little bit, but what we find here is that these Yeshe are actually quite closely related stylistically to various parts of the official history of the Ming. And of course, as you can see, they're fairly well dispersed in it. The reason this is so big is because it's an extremely long work, and it's about a lot of different subjects, and it has different sections of very distinct styles, which we will see later in our analysis. So we can see here, this is also a Yeshe, but this is the national fragrance. And what we can see, this is actually not more closely related to this because of the way it's set up. It could be flipped. But part of this Yeshe is also integrated into the Ming, or seems to be related very closely. So what we're seeing here is, according to this very preliminary analysis, these Yeshe have a lot of stylistic relationships with official histories. But this still doesn't tell us a whole lot about Yeshe as a general class, or can we distinguish them in general from vernacular novels. Now, this is the same type of analysis, but this actually uses 10,000 word samples. This is done using the Stanford word parser, which does have its problems. But when you run this with characters, it gives you a fairly similar analysis. And for whatever reason, this actually groups very well by genre. To give you a quick rundown of what's happening here, along the top here are the more vernacular works. And in light blue are vernacular novels. Interspersed among them are vernacular short stories. And it's actually very, very distinct from the more classical works, which you have along the bottom. Almost all of the Yeshe are in this particular clade here. And this is an unclassified novel that I'm actually not sure if it's vernacular or classical, but I would guess it's probably classical. And interestingly, there are several BG that are dispersed throughout here. But what's most interesting is most of the BG are over here. And if you might know, Yeshe and BG are often considered the same genre, distinguished mostly by content. Yeshe is a subset of BG. But what's breaking apart the Yeshe in this particular figure are official histories, and then a little further over here are the classical novels. And these two guys here, these vernacular novels, that's actually the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and the Romance of the Five Dynasties. So again, fairly classical works. Now, if we want to try and better understand what is happening in these texts stylistically that's causing them to be where they are, we have to, I think, move away from this type of hierarchical cluster analysis and move into the PCA. And I think if we go back to those first 14 texts, this is what principal component analysis is showing us. And the first principal component here accounts for 50% of the variance within the data set. And in fact, this is a very large amount. In many types of analysis, when we're trying to figure out who an author is, we might see 23, 25%. And then the second principal component is 10% here. Now, there are some interesting things happening here because in the upper left-hand corner are all of the Yeshe. And they're very closely packed together. And underneath them is actually one of the classical novels. The difference, though, is that it's a little more dispersed. Internally, it seems to have a higher variance of vocabulary in it. The various vernacular novels, the major Ming Dynasty novels, are quite dispersed across this map because they are both very long and they are extremely well written and contain a lot of very interesting vocabulary. So it's not too surprising that they don't cluster up quite in the same way that other genres do. Most of the drama fit in the middle here. In the blue here is the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the Water Margin. The Jinping Mei is up in the right-hand corner, and then the yellow is the Journey to the West. But why are these texts falling where they do? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we can actually look at the characters and see how each of them are influencing where these texts are showing up here. And apologies for the small font. There are some encoding issues that make these things really difficult to produce. But what we see here is that on the left of this figure are characters that are more traditionally associated or more closely associated with classical Chinese. Characters like zhi, yi, wei, qi, er, yu, yue. All of these are particles that are very important in classical Chinese, but not as much in vernacular Chinese. And on the right, we get more personal pronouns, things that tend to be markers of vernacular. So what's happening here, excuse me, is very interesting to me, because what we have is not, this is a classical text, this is a vernacular text, but rather we have a gradient. We have a spectrum on which all of these different texts are falling. So we can start to see that, well, the Yeshe tend to accumulate more classical Chinese markers, whereas the other texts tend to be more vernacular. The problem, of course, is those Yeshe are all clustering together. But again, it's only 4 Yeshe, so how do we move beyond just those 4 Yeshe and try to say something more about the genre as a whole? Well, we can perform the exact same analysis using about 45 different Yeshe, and most of these are coming from the Zhonghua Lishi Quanji Zhonghua Yeshe, a group in Beijing digitized about 72 Yeshe, and you can actually, about 45 of them are longer than 10,000 characters, so that's actually not a cutoff, that's kind of the arbitrary one that I imposed upon these, but the shorter texts you deal with, the more variability you're going to introduce. But the interesting thing here is there's actually not much interesting happening. There's one text that uses jur a lot, but that's only one. Otherwise, these principal components don't account for much variance within this data set. All of these texts are using relatively homogeneous vocabulary. Now, if we want to try and see how they relate to official historical documents, we can do something like this. This is a principal component analysis using 38 Yeshe and the official history of the Ming. And what we find is the vast majority of these Yeshe fall in the middle here and overlap with the Ming history. And what's happening here is they're actually overlapping with the biographical sections of the Ming history rather than any of the other sections. These spots down here, these outliers actually, if you look at the loadings, tend to contain a lot more numbers and dates. And the upper left-hand corner tend to include geographical markers like mountains, rivers, fu, various things like that. So what we're finding here is that most Yeshe, now if we included some, like the Guoque, we would find that, which is an analytic Yeshe, it would probably fall down here somewhere. But the very interesting thing is that this is showing us about a lot of different Yeshe, and they tend to function in very similar manners. Now, what we set out to do, or rather what I set out to do when I was doing this, is try to see if I could learn from a stylistic, stylometric analysis, if we could differentiate Yeshe from novels on the one hand and official histories on the other. So what can we say about Yeshe using some of these techniques? Well, we can say that they were mostly classical texts with relatively homogeneous vocabularies, and they relate closely to classical novels, but not quite as closely to vernacular novels, or in fact quite distantly to vernacular novels. And finally, they are stylistically similar to historical biographies. This is not to say that every Yeshe that was ever written is like this. In fact, there are many exceptional Yeshe that fall far outside of this conception. But what's very interesting to me is that this allows us to move away from just the exceptional ones and start to look more closely at the average ones. And this type of analysis lets us move a little deeper into the genre than we could initially see. there's an interesting connection, I think, between the relationship between these historical biographies and these Yeshe. Basically because it places Yeshe in a place that's intricately related with a lot of the development of novels out of early historical biographies in the Tang, and later a lot of interconnections. In the end, though, well, I think the question of what Yeshe are stylistically becomes a little more clear. The give and take that's happening in the late Imperial period between bibliographers and historians and commentators is not necessarily all that more clear. We don't know who had a better idea of what Yeshe was, but we can, I think, understand the confusion a little better. And that's what, to me, is so exciting about this type of analysis. So I think as we move forward from this type of analysis, we need to start including a lot more texts that currently don't exist. The more we include, the better this gets. And we need more novels on, or rather, I need more novels on current events. I need to look at more official histories like the Zizhi the comprehensive mirrored aid and governance, and various types of things like that to see, does this analysis continue to stand up? Does it get better? Does it get worse? Because it might get worse. Further, we also need, I think, to look more closely. Can we use these tools to better understand what Yeshe are in relation to BG, which are also very similar collections of texts that are largely defined based on content, or so it seems. Now, I think the conclusion that I've come to is this methodology is quite good for clustering text by genre in the Chinese case. But I want to talk a little bit, just very, very briefly, about this type of analysis and what we're doing when we do it, because this is a form of reading in spite all of its trappings of statistics and science. Everybody who does this type of analysis is likely going to come to a slightly different conclusion. Now, my hope is that people will come to similar conclusions, but you never know. And Stephen Ramsey at the University of Nebraska, who's an English professor, has written a book called Reading Machines Toward an Algorithmic Criticism, which is essentially a theoretical defense of this approach, because he says that this is much like Marxism, in that it's just a set of tools that allows a new view on Chinese literature, or for him, he's talking about English literature. But it shouldn't be discounted just because it's so different. Or to paraphrase what Hans Sassi has said about literary theory, stylometry and these digital techniques, I think, are they're the pigs that I'm trying to use to find the truffles in a forest that's basically Chinese literature. Thank you so much for coming today. Very quick acknowledgements. My advisor, Tina Liu at Yale. Peter Leonard is the digital humanities librarian there, and he's helped with some of this. The Online Computer Library Center has given me access to their data and their API, which I've used for a lot of the bibliographic information. At the Academia Sinica, the Institute of Chinese Lit and Philosophy is where I was doing most of my work last year with funding from Fulbright Taiwan, and also the Fairbank Center for having me here and allowing me to continue to do some of this kind of off-the-wall research. And finally, my wife Shannon Stewart, who's a scientist and has been able to help me a lot with the statistics and interpretations and keeping me from saying things that the data doesn't actually suggest. So thank you very much, and I really would love to hear any questions, because this is kind of a bizarre approach to Chinese literature.
I first of all must apologize because I forgot to mention that Paul is our Wang fellow this year, and that's why he's here. So it's just, I was just remiss, so I apologize for that. Now we open the floor to questions. If you have any.
I have a question about what you presented. It's a fascinating presentation. But I'm wondering, could you run current Chinese newspaper articles through this and say, here's a liberal face coming and here's a conservative face coming?
You could. You have an advantage because journal articles or newspaper articles are going to be in the same genre. So you don't have to worry too much about conventions of the form distorting your signal. In English, a lot of people are doing projects that actually latch onto genre to the level of this is a romance likely written in the 19th century in the UK. This is another type of genre. So they're looking at very small subgenres within novels. So I think you could actually identify a lot of things like that.
Principal.
So I would expect that most people who study literature would be, their reaction to this is somewhere between being appalled and being confused.
I think that's fair.
I'd like to hear you reflect a little bit about the field, both where you think this is going within literary studies, within social sciences, within large corpus text analysis. It seems to be widely accepted that this is one of the more promising things to do.
Yeah.
But in humanistic studies, perhaps not. And so if you'd like to just talk about where you think this is going, what you think the obstacles to it are, what...
Well...
And then finally, with a lot more questions on, what you need to know to be able to do this.
Sure. Well, I think in terms of where it's going, there's a lot of promise in letting us access texts that are not, they don't receive much of attention because they're simply just not that enjoyable to read. But because there are so many of them from the late Imperial period, they're still actually quite important if we're trying to understand how people are writing about things. Now, the reaction that I've had when presenting this research in Taiwan is that people are actually a little more excited than I thought they would be, because people have kind of been neglecting, even in Taiwan, this type of literature. Now, 10 years ago, this was completely unaccepted in literary studies, but I think people in English and people in Western literatures have been doing a lot of work to show people that we can actually learn a lot of very interesting things. They've identified collaborators with Shakespeare. They've been able to really look at how different genres emerge at different times. So it's something that, in order to get over a lot of these criticisms, I think Stephen Ramsey has a good point in that this is very, very similar in a lot of ways to, Marxism, or if we're going to do a Foucauldian reading, or if we're going to look at from a postmodernist perspective. These are tools. We just have to reassure people that we don't think that we're doing science, because a lot of people get offended, I think justifiably so, to think that we can reduce literature, which is supposed to be beautiful, into a set of numbers, just a grab bag. So I think this is good for studying, again, who an author might have been, characteristics of genre, but we can't really get away from, nor should we get away from, detailed, close readings, because that's why we do this in the first place. It's just very, very good for getting, or that's why I do it in the first place. Other people might have different reasons, but it's really good, though, to still step back, because this is part of the picture that we don't get a lot of. But again, people are not as resistant to this as I thought they might be. But because I've only really delved into this in the last 2 or 3 years, I've had the advantage of the level with which technology and basically large data sets have integrated into people's lives. It's gotten much more understandable for the average person, I think.
Could I ask a question of everybody in the room? How many of you have ever done any kind of text analysis like this?
I worked on the Moss Stellar paper
Really?
project.
So-
Yeah, I did.
so-
Yeah.
Wow.
So
But-
Billy, Nathan, Ian, right?
Devin.
Devin too?
Yeah.
But have you come across the response, have you come across people saying, well, but I know that already?
Yes.
I know that Yeshi is more Wenyan than Baihua, that is actually in
Yes.
some places quite close to Zhenshi. I know it's different from the Baihua Xiaoshuo. Have you come across people
Yeah,
like that?
absolutely, and I think that's a very fair criticism, because sometimes it does seem like it's just telling us what we already know. Now, in the cases, I think, with Yeshi, and how it sometimes manages to differentiate itself from BT, that's actually not something that I think a lot of people had seen before. And I think as we get better ways of parsing these texts and more of them become available, I can start to curate my terms and get a better focus on what these differences are. Because yes, that they are different from Baihua Xiaoshuo is not in and of itself that surprising. It is to me intriguing that we can just determine that based on no semantic knowledge of what's happening, just a statistical analysis of these different vectors.
Professor Dunn was, you were
Oh,
going to
yes,
ask a
yes,
question.
okay.
And then-
Thank you very much for
Mhm.
an interesting presentation. Okay, based on my understanding of your approach,
Mhm.
I have one question.
Sure.
So, for your analysis between the classical style
Mhm.
Chinese compositions or the vernacular, right? You choose some, Chinese characters,
Mhm.
and these characters normally used in more classical style
Mhm.
compositions. For example, 知乎者也.
Right.
And then you choose these characters to make your analysis to
Mhm.
see whether this kind of composition is more classical style
Mhm.
and or vernacular style.
Mhm.
So you set these vocabularies first.
No.
No.
No. I
Oh.
do not set the vocabulary at all.
Oh.
All it does is it counts how often the characters are showing up in these texts.
Okay.
So the
that's great.
reasons that these characters, they break apart the way they do is it's because these texts are just using zhi. In fact, the most common character in all of these texts is actually bu. But there's no generic difference for use of this character, so it doesn't amount to anything in this
That's
analysis.
great. But normally you see that there's no, how to say, abstract difference between classical style composition and the vernacular style composition. More writings just between
Yes.
the typical classical composition and the
Right.
vernacular composition. So how to make your, your
It's-
analysis more,
Well, I think because this is purely taken from what's actually seen in the texts, what you find is that these pieces of literature are not distinctly vernacular or distinctly classical. Now, it is possible that we could come up with a set of terms that would divide them very clearly. These are classical and these are vernacular, and that's how a lot of the hierarchical clustering works, is it's mutually exclusive. When it pairs texts off, they can't fall on top of each other like they do in the principal component analysis. But the nature of these texts is that they all contain sections that are more typified by classical language and more typified by vernacular. Now, if, for instance, we put in, like, the Tangshi in this, they would likely all be very, very distinctly classical. Whereas when we're including novels, because of their length and because of their internal inconsistencies, they tend to fall along a spread. And the nice thing about this analysis is I don't actually have to choose anything. All I'm doing is counting characters. So it's, to me, I think it's a very interesting.
so how to choose the characters?
Like I say, it's just what you do is you take the text and then you have a computer program count how many times each of these characters show up, and then you compare how many times does this show up in this text and how many times does it show up in this text. So I actually don't choose anything. If anybody's interested in what you actually need to know to do something like this, a little bit of knowledge of a scripting language helps. I think Ian and I were actually talking about this the other day. The most important thing to learn first, I think, would be regular expressions. This allows you to pick out things from text in a very good way. But to clean up the text, generally you need to know a little bit about using regular expressions to just eliminate the kind of the dirty stuff that's in the text. Not like morally dirty, but just like English characters and things like that. And then you can use, like, I tend to use Ruby, but Python I think is actually better for this. And then you would write it into a file without all of the various English characters, and then you can actually stick them into Stylo, which does most of the stuff for you. So just a quick knowledge of how to use R, and you can do this. So it takes a little while to pick up the tools, but I think most people can do it with a few weeks of pretty concentrated work.
Joanna and then Alex.
Mhm.
And let me just backtrack to this,
Mhm.
because you said you don't pick the characters,
Right.
but then you mentioned 100 characters. Is that after the sorting?
Yeah,
or-
so I should clarify. Those are the 100 most common characters across the entire data set. So that I do pick those in terms of, I say, use the 100 most common characters. I could alternatively say, use the 100 to the 200 most common, or use the first 1,000 most common. And based on how many we're including there, or what set of them we are including, we can start to see slightly different things, like authorship or genre more than say, here what we're getting a lot of is just, this is classical, this is vernacular.
what if one were to start with the least common? Would it
You
help
can-
you
I agree.
answer the question why someone
That-
would choose to write in Yeshe rather than xiaoshuo?
To a certain extent, yes, because as you get into the least common characters, you start to get much more semantically meaningful things, where you're looking much more at content in those cases rather than style. So because what I'm interested in is stylistic differences in this particular talk, we look at the most common ones because those tend to be better ways of pulling out these differences. But if you move away from that, you start to get more content. And that is actually quite useful, and it might be a good way of trying to pull these Yeshe out of the larger set of what we consider BG. So it is useful, but it also tends to look a little dirtier. It's a little less clear. There's a lot more noise in the data when we do that. Because sometimes, you might get a set of very uncommon characters that don't show up in any other texts, and then it becomes a little harder to compare them. So if you use, like, say, the 2500th to 2600th most frequent characters, you might start to see more content and still be able to do a lot of comparisons.
Alex.
Yeah, I think with respect to the question of doesn't this tell us something that we already know, I think maybe you don't want to disclaim science too quickly.
Okay.
Because your response to that actually made me think of Thomas Kuhn's distinction between normal science and paradigm-breaking science. And one of the key things that he sees is that normal science gives you what you expect up to a certain point, but as you further refine your software or refine your mechanisms, eventually you hit upon that thing that just blows everything apart.
Yeah.
And then you run into trouble. And that seems to be kind of what your answer
Yeah.
is, that will happen. Eventually, at some point, there will be something that will be very, very counterintuitive.
Yeah.
The question that I had was about your take on the concept of style. And from your description of what you're doing so far, it sounds a little bit like, to try to use a metaphor, if you had a giant warehouse and you got many different types of vehicles and took them all apart down to the screws and bolts and tires and so on, and then you asked somebody to come in and look at those heaps of parts and decide what the vehicles were. And so one question that I have is that for most of us, the difference between a Ferrari and a minivan is intuitively obvious as soon as we see it. To what extent, if we just look at things according to piles of components, can we then necessarily access higher order principles? Rather than just saying, well, the Ferrari has more screws of this type, and the minivan has more screws of that type. Just by looking at the screws, can we then make a jump to a higher order mode of organization?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, is a fair question. I think that in terms of how languages work, in particular in late Imperial China, we can in fact jump from how many times does Zhu show up in a text and a general comment on what style is likely to have. It's when you take an aggregate, not just the screws, but also things like the exhaust manifold. That's when you start to see, okay, here's some meaningful things like, yeah, the Ferrari might have 40% fewer screws than an average minivan, but when we start to combine it with, it has, its, intake is like this, its exhaust is like this, that's where a lot of this, I think, meaning starts to come out of. So the zhs and the who's and the zhs and the yeah, that's very lower level stuff. But then when you start to increase what's going on, you can start to see more and more of, okay, this is a stylistic thing because, the Sanguozhi Yanyi is using yue all the time, but, the Shuihu Zhuan doesn't. And that is a stylistic choice. And I think that's where we have to kind of move up. If we're just looking at those things, it does tell us a surprising amount of stuff. But as we start to include more, it gets more and more intricate and interesting.
And is it your sense that in the future, the techniques that you're using, we will be able to move up?
Yeah, I mean,
techniques?
I think we just need to a certain extent, a lot of it has to do with how well word parsers work. the math is already there. There's a lot of very brilliant scientists and computer scientists who are providing us with interesting statistical tools and models for this. A lot of it's figuring out how we can use it for Chinese literature. And a lot of it's just getting more digitized texts. But I think it gets better and better.
Ian, and then, yeah, Ian.
So you've already addressed sort of what to do when your model tells you something that you think you already know. What do you do when it tells you something that conflicts? How do you tell when it tells you something that conflicts with your existing impression, whether that's a problem with your algorithm or whether that's a problem with the existing frameworks?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing I do when I run into an example like that is just triple check everything. Because a lot of times if you get something really weird, it's because you accidentally deleted something, or you're comparing a traditional character text with a simplified character text. If you get something that's very, very strongly conflicting, I think you have to start looking at the actual texts themselves. So what you would do is, because you know where all of these things are coming from, otherwise it's hard to go back and interpret them, to look and say, okay, well, why is this particular unexpected piece of text relating so closely to this other one? And then you can start to get a sense, should this or should this not be where it is? And then if it should be where it is, then you have to figure out what's going on. And that's where it gets really exciting. And for me, that's mostly all of these yesh are being so distinct from the BG. But you just have to go and look to make sure, because it can be, you can get false positives a lot.
Can they be distinguished from BT? I mean, 国雀 okay is, but the other things that Tan Qian wrote, 北邮杂组, 北邮录, 早年杂组, those things are called both 野史 and BT,
Right.
even in ordinary classification.
So I think, again, what we always come back to is that yesh are often a subset of BG. But there are BG that are not yesh, and to understand, well, why, what are those texts? What do they look like? You have to kind of, do these types of analysis and go back and look at them.
But I deserve someone else
Please.
who should be asking the question.
I've got two related questions. When I try to write about genre or think about what I'm doing with genre, I'm always unsure about what I mean. And when I go on the internet to find an answer, that makes me less sure than even I thought I was. There aren't any clear definitions of genre that I can find, and they vary between content-based definition and a stylistic-based definition. And you seem to be going through the stylistic one, but as you're also observing content and style intertwined, depending on which corpus you're looking at. So I guess one of the potentials of this sort of approach is to revisit questions of what genre is and what we mean by genre. And my second question, and I guess my question, the first question is then, where is the field that you're involved in, I guess, heading in relation to that question of what genre is, what's popping up?
Right.
That's the first question. And the second one is, why use the given genre labels at all? Why not? I mean, I could see in some of those graphical presentations that you had that there were 4 areas of grey that were clustered together. Aren't they the genres in some of, aren't you discovering actually that where the statistical genres aren't actually where the traditional genre labels are? And that's just the second question.
I think that's a really interesting point. The difficulty is claiming that my statistical analysis is so accurate that that it's a better definition of how people have been reading these things in the past. Because it does go back to a question of what is a genre? Is it based on the style? And that's what this is getting at. This is saying, okay, well, if we're using a completely style-based heuristic to decide what genre is, then yes, maybe what you're saying is more accurate. But there are a lot of other considerations that go into when we consider genre in terms of how they're socially approached, who's writing them. I think late Imperial bibliographers would absolutely say that who writes a text matters just as much as the style of the text. So I think that we can learn more about texts and how they relate and stylistic genres, but that doesn't tell us quite as much about the social construction of genre. Unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for your question, but I think it is a good observation that sometimes what we see is different than what people initially conceive of them as. Because is something like the Jinpingmei, the Plum and the Golden Vase, the same genre as the Sanguozhi Yanyi? Well, they're really quite different, but they have the same structure. They're all 120 or 100 chapter novels. They integrate various different types of heteroglossic pieces. So it's a tough question to answer, I think.
And it goes back to Professor Bob's question earlier about what do you need to know in the first place to start asking questions.
And it's difficult to, I think, come up with good answers to what this means without a familiarity with the texts themselves and the social environment in which they're being written. Just coming it blind if you come into this thing blind and do this analysis, you might come away with the wrong impression and just assume that you've discovered something and people may not buy it. So.
Liu Chen and then Dylan. Okay. Liu Chen is writing her thesis on Song Biji, so
okay.
She has read hundreds of them.
No. Just to follow up on the question about Yeshu versus Biji, I'm wondering what's your standard of choosing Biji texts? Because Yeshu you would have some contemporary collection called those are Yeshu.
Right.
But Biji from Ming bibliographies, they would come from both 史部, 集部, and 子部.
Generally, I depend on people who know far more about this than I do. A lot of late Imperial bibliographers and contemporary bibliographies, because I am personally very poor at distinguishing what a BG is and what isn't a BG. Yeshu as being part of that, are also very difficult to pick out, and that's partially why I started on this type of analysis, to figure out, why are different people concluding that this is a Yeshu and this is just a non-Yeshu BG. So it's a difficult question to answer. And that's why I think that this is such an attractive approach to it.
Because I feel within BG there are 史料笔记 which are close to histories. But if you're looking at intellectual BG, then they are close to all the treatises.
Yeah,
and there are yet another group of BG close to other kind of classical writings.
Yeah, and then that goes back to the question, is BG a stylistic genre or is it more of a socially constructed genre? And it is a socially constructed genre because of this exact reason. And when you do this analysis, those treatises, like the ones that seem like treatises, are going to show up with the treatises in this analysis. They're not going to show up with hopefully they're not going to show up with the Shiliang.
So Dylan.
Yeah, a quick practical question and then a more substantial one. First of all, the programs you're using, they also generate your graphical representations?
Stylo does have a package that does produce these, and if you're using R, there are functions that do it.
Okay. And then I guess to continue with this BG and Yeshu, so what exactly are you finding? Because it occurs to me that one thing that can go with this kind of character frequency analysis is simply if subject matters are different. Yeah. You know, a unofficial history about a palace is going to talk a lot more about eunuchs than a piece of writing on landscape. Right. So what exactly are you seeing right now?
Well, right now, content does not actually significantly influence our results.
Okay.
And that's why it's attractive to me, is because it doesn't. If we're trying to get at content, again, we're going to have to move up to a higher level of frequent words like Joanna Hamlin-Smith was just talking to us about. So what you're saying is absolutely true, but we're operating at a level that's a little bit below content.
So what's differentiating? Could you just go more into detail about what you're finding with these two genres?
Basically that the ones that there seems to be some somewhat stylistic difference between what people generally call a Yeshu and your average BG. And it's not just based on the content. It's based on the 100 most frequent words in the data set, like how often does it use the character yue? Almost never. And so the other BG, because I actually have not done the loadings for the comparisons between the BG, because that's actually an active open question in my research. What are these stylistic differences? I don't know specifically why they break apart in the way that they do quite yet.
Okay.
But the advantage of this is that's actually pretty easy to find out.
We have time for one last question.
Oh, okay. It's not a question, maybe just a general comment. Because I do a lot of quantitative research, and here I also recently one of my research about the text mining on consumers' review on their doctors. So I mean, for general quantitative research, we try to just use some mathematical modeling or statistical analysis, provide some evidence for some conclusion. But sometimes we may think, oh, this conclusion is so obvious, why do you need to do this? But quantitative analysis just do this, for labor study, we use a complicated regression model to show a man on average make more salary than women. People sometimes ask, why do you do this? We all know, but still we need to do this. This is quantitative research. And for text mining, I think there's a lot of use also on consumer reviews, not on Amazon, right? We all buy something on Amazon. You see there are reviews. There are millions of reviews. And usually when we do text mining, we find some, first, surely we find the frequency of the words they use. And sometimes there are some a little complicated model, we can find some sentimental meanings. Because sometimes reviewers will not say good or bad directly.
Right.
They comment on camera like a clear or or sharp or something like that. I think that's another branch of the text mining. And so I said just a general comment. So that's very interesting to see this. And yeah, that's right. Because when I see principal component analysis, this is some model that I use very often. So very interesting. Okay, just general comment.
Thank you.
Do you have time for one more? Or?
One last question.
Question, sorry, about trying to figure out the question of genre and styles. Have you done anything about, or are there any digitized commentaries that comment on them to see if there's different styles of commenting on a text that might help define it in a secondary fashion?
Most people, when they digitize these texts, do not digitize the commentaries. Sadly, I wish there were, but that's for the moment. We're just limited by what people are choosing to digitize. There are actually projects out there, and one that just got a lot of funding to have scholars come together to digitize these texts in a way that is consistent and would include these types of commentaries. So soon we should be able to see that, but for the moment it's kind of out of reach.
Well, thank you all, and thank you very much, Paul, for a very exciting presentation.